Tim, I know it's been a whirlwind last couple of days, what with the decision coming out, the voting results coming out. Let's break this down maybe step by step as we get into this. Schools had an opportunity to vote on this, school districts. Each school got one vote. Maybe just take us through the process before we get into the results and how all that worked out. What was the process in all of this?
Sure. Yeah, every spring, Marty, our schools have the referendum voting process. And a lot of years it flies under the radar screen. You know, a lot of years the general public and fans are not aware of the little things that schools are voting on. But we go through it every spring. It's a way that our schools can have any kind of edit or change to the Constitution or bylaws. So, you know, anytime we're going to change the handbook or those kind of rules, it has to come through a vote of the membership. So in April, our staff and Executive Director Doug Ute goes out to our member schools and explains what they're voting on. We hold regional update meetings where we walk through what all these measures are the schools are going to vote on. The voting window this year was May 1st through May 16th. The principal at the high school casts the vote. It's done electronically. We intend and expect that to be a vote of the school. So the superintendent and the athletic director are involved in that, but the principal is actually the one that casts the vote. And the Monday evening, May 16th, we were tabulating all the results and crafting how we would display the results on Tuesday morning. So it was definitely a very busy and hectic Monday, Tuesday morning we made the announcement. And so now we move forward from here.
Tim, when you broke down how all this works, how much are the principals of these districts encouraged to get input from coaches, athletic directors? You mentioned that it's a district-wide vote cast by one member, the principal of the schools. But from that standpoint, how much are they encouraged by the OHSAA to get that information? Is it something they take up on their own basis? I would imagine it's something that, I mean, they can't just make the call by themselves. They have to get that input. But how much are they encouraged to do that?
Sure. We really encourage them to get that input. In fact, I would think, you know, the superintendent is the one in charge of the school and in charge of the school district. So if you're a principal, you really need to have a good talk with the superintendent, because the last thing you'd want to do is, as a principal, cast your vote. The superintendent comes down the hall and asks, how'd you vote, if you're not on the same page. So it's, you know, the superintendents certainly have a lot to do with that. But, you know, the athletic directors certainly need to be consulted too. And in some schools, it's more than others. You know, in some schools, the principal is heavily involved in athletics and, you know, is going to talk with the superintendent, talk with the athletic director. In some school districts, the principal is not really involved in athletics a whole lot. And so they really need to lean on the input from the athletic director and the superintendent. But we strongly encourage those three groups of people to get together and talk. And it's an interesting process, though, because the opinion and the vote recommendation that the superintendent says oftentimes could be different than what the athletic director wants to do. That could certainly be different than what a coach wants to do. We see that a lot, where the coach's voice or the coach's wish is not in line with what the superintendent wants. But, you know, we have to lean on the superintendents and the principals. Those are the folks that run the school district, and we've been that way for 120 years. So we have to lean on those principals and superintendents, and this is another example of that.
The margin of defeat of this, 538 to 254, voted against it. We'll break down a little bit more into all of that aspect of it. Did that surprise you, the margin that this went down?
It did a little bit, Marty. I thought it would be a little closer than that. But, you know, looking back on it now, at our regional update meetings where we went around to the state and talked about it, the vibe and the questions certainly were not overly positive. You know, you could tell the sentiment was that a little frustration that NIL was in their lap now already at the high school level. We haven't even lived with it yet for a year at the college level. So we all could sense that tone, but I've said this a few times, how a school voted, or whether you voted yes or no for it, may not necessarily be in line with whether you liked it or not. You know, I don't think there are many people who like NIL. I don't even like NIL at the college level. But, you know, certainly a lot of people are not going to like it at the high school level. But part of what we tried to explain to our schools is that part of why this proposal was in front of them now is because maybe it's going to be better than what could come down the tracks in a few months. You know, that could be a court case. It could be something a lawmaker brings up. So what we try to do is explain that, you know, this might be a way to stave off unintended things that could happen out of our control down the road. So I think our schools knew that. I think they understood that, but I think they were saying, hey, we can handle what happens down the road, but we don't want to be the ones right now that say, yes, let's do NIL at the high school level. They did not want to do that right now, for sure.
And Tim, I think one of the things that maybe is somewhat overlooked in all of this for the schools is how this would have been governed. How do you police this with so many other things that go on? Obviously, your staff doesn't have, your office doesn't have the staffing to do something like this. It would be up to the schools if this does go through and when it does pass. And you laid out the guidelines, I think, pretty succinctly as to what would be allowed, what would not be allowed. But in the overall, it kind of falls on the schools, which is just one more thing. An athletic administrator who these days, I mean, let's face it, they're having trouble finding officials. They're having trouble finding umpires. They're having trouble just getting games played these days. That's one more thing that they had to worry about. And I don't know that there was an overall feeling of, oh, good, one more thing on our plate for us to deal with now, especially something like this.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That was certainly a question that came up at our regional update meetings. Athletic directors were saying, who is going to govern this? And the thing, it was kind of an opportunity, though, for us to say, well, for all of our OHSAA regulations, the school is primary enforcement. We say that a lot, but you know, I think about the NCAA all the time because I think their compliance and infractions department now is something like 200 people. We have 2, and you do games with one of them. So you know, it's not something that our office can take over and enforce and regulate for 817 schools from a boots on the ground standpoint. For all of our bylaws, you know, if a student is academically eligible, the school determines that. You know, we set the bylaw that governs academic eligibility, and then the guidance counselors and the principals and athletic directors, they take those regulations in. They've been voted by the schools, and they enforce it. And then we go from there. If there's a violation reported, if we're aware of a potential violation, then we get involved. But for all of our OHSAA bylaws and our constitutional items, the school administrators are primary enforcement. So this would be a new bylaw that would go onto their plate, like all the other bylaws are already on their plate. So certainly they're not going to ask for new things to be put on their plate. But so, you know, if NIL at the high school level comes into effect one way or another down the road, we'd all have to work with it then anyway. So, you know, I think that certainly that initial reaction is that, hey, this is one more thing on our plate. That they're right. It would have been. I think anytime we have a new bylaw, there could be that kind of reaction to it. So I think it's an education process. It's an experience process. And, but again, I think it goes back to, we've only lived with NIL for a short time, relatively speaking. At the college level, we're all still trying to get our arms around what this means and also the unintended consequences. Gosh, we could talk for a while about that. And I think they were leery of potentially some of those unintended consequences that we've seen at the college level seeping down into the high school level. So, and I completely understand that hesitancy.
Tim, you had said earlier that, like it or not, this is here, and it's here to stay. It may change in its dynamics in the coming years or however it's able to be utilized by student athletes, but it is here, and I think it is here to stay, whether, again, any of us like it or not. I guess with that in mind, Tim, is there worry in your office that with it failing in the statewide vote that we could see you mentioned perhaps a state lawmaker trying to push the law through, or legal challenges to this. Heck, there have even been student athletes who've already had plans in place hoping this would go through to already start cashing in on it. How concerned are you that this is going to go another step as far as, I don't know, legal challenges or things along those lines?
Well, I don't know if worry is quite the right word, but it's close to that. But, it's one of those, just like all of our other bylaws, our schools vote them into place and we do the best we can to enforce it. If a courtroom steps in and changes it, or if a state law comes in and changes one of our bylaws, you deal with it and you move on. I think a really strong piece of information or evidence, if you will, if it gets to a court setting, that is on our side is that we can present in court. We took this issue to our member schools and they voted no overwhelmingly. So take that piece of information and do with it what you may. But that's a really strong opinion by our schools to vote it down almost 2-1. So could we be in court? Sure. There's certainly, I could see several scenarios where we would be faced with a litigation situation very soon. I hope not, but yeah, that certainly could happen. Now, if a lawmaker picks it up, certainly, I think there will be a little bit of chatter about that. I think there certainly could be some lawmakers that look into that, that certainly start asking some questions, because constituents in their districts are going to push them on that. There's a number of student athletes that I'll give you some examples that are going to be seniors this fall. They've already committed to play, let's just say, Division I football. Well, those are well-known student athletes. They are already lining up potentially NIL deals for when they are in college. They just can't do it yet. And it could be that, the ear of a lawmaker certainly picks up on that and decides to push it a little bit. I think we have a pretty good relationship with lawmakers around the state. Doug Ute does a really good job with cultivating those relationships and understanding what we do and why we do it, and that education-based athletics is so important for students' overall well-being, and that's the reason a lot of kids go to school and strive to get good grades so they can play sports. And so that certainly is a big part of what we do. I think what our schools are saying is the NIL component is not a part of that right now. And so we'll continue to keep an eye on it.
Couple points, and we'll let you go, Tim. Number one, I've heard this argument brought up, or maybe argument's not the right word, but concern, I guess, from high school fans across the state. This will create a trickle, maybe not even a trickle, but maybe a stream of student athletes leaving the state of Ohio, going to states where they can cash in on this. You certainly saw in Quinn Ewers, the quarterback from Texas, who came to Ohio State because he could capitalize on that at the collegiate level. We've seen that happen. Is that a concern of your office, that we could see a number of student athletes and their families going somewhere where they can cash in because of this?
I don't think it would be a stream, but certainly a trickle. Could that happen? That could happen. I hope not. But, to a certain extent, we already see that a little bit with mainly in basketball, students leaving a school in Ohio or another state and going to an academy, whether that's IMG, whether that's Findlay Prep, whether that's one of the schools out west, that they're not a school necessarily, but they're more like a high school AAU team. So that already happens a little bit, where some of the really high-end athletes forego maybe their senior year at high school, or even junior and senior year, to go to a prep school. So sure, that could happen. You mentioned Quinn, the quarterback that left Texas to come to Ohio State early and start earning money on the NIL deals. I certainly hope that doesn't happen a lot. Could it happen? Sure. There's already 9 states in our country that allow NIL at the high school level. Those 9 states have been in the news a little bit, so I think the word is getting out where student athletes could go to pursue an NIL deal at the high school level. Certainly hope that doesn't happen. I think that would be a very limited number of kids that would attempt to do that, but yeah, it could happen.
Tim, let's wrap it up with this. I think it's important to remind everybody that the Ohio High School Athletic Association, you work at the behest of your schools. So how these things work out, you put the issue out to the schools. You didn't rule. This is what we think. This is how we believe it should go. We want you to make this decision. Here's the issue. We may not like it, but we know it's coming, and it's something we're going to have to deal with. So here it is. We're going to put it out in front of you. You give us the answer, what you think is going to how this work is how this will work, rather. Because I know, and you know this very, very well, you guys get run over the skewers just about every day, no matter what decision you make from anybody at any level, be it high school football coaches, fans, whatever. But in the overall of this, Tim, you put it out to the schools, and the schools resoundingly said no. And I think that's an important thing for everybody to remember in all of this.
Yeah, you're right. I did see a couple of those headlines that the OHSAA said no, or that we voted it down at the office, which, as you mentioned, that's certainly not true. We try to make it as clear as we can, but we put this proposal on the ballot. Our board of directors, which is elected by our schools, they said, yes, let's put that out to our schools to vote on. And our schools overwhelmingly said, no, we do not want this. This is not right for us right now. So certainly as a staff, as a board, we put it out there for them to vote on. And, it's interesting. If this had passed, we would be talking here about what this means for the next step, and that our schools said, yes, they do want it. So either way, there's very few referendum issues that we have a strong opinion on one way or the other. These are things that come to us throughout the year, that are things we've either worked with on an appeal or a school has brought forward. We talk about it with our elected board of directors, and then we decide, okay, yeah, let's put this out on the ballot for our schools to vote on. Typically, it's here's the issue, you vote and tell us how you want to move forward. Pretty rarely is there an issue that we really push for and say, yes, we want this to pass. The NIL proposal was one that we just put out there and let our schools vote on. If they had passed it, we would support the fact that they passed it and that they did want to move forward on it. So either way, we were going to be having a lot of NIL talk this week and for weeks to come, no matter what. But yeah, our schools voted it down very strongly. I think they sent a strong message that they do not want this coming into high school athletics at this time.
Tim Stried, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for your insight.
Thanks, Marty. Anytime.